Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at executive privilege, which is a key part of the presidency and the executive branch. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson and to scroll down the correct section and get ready to fill in the blanks and answer any key concept questions that happen to appear and coincide with the notes. Remember that you can replay any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. Let's go ahead and get started. Something to think about here is the essence of how much power the president has. Richard Nixon's quote pretty much explains how powerful the president has become. When the president does it, that means that it's not illegal. An interesting quote when you think about what happened during the Nixon years. However, today we're going to expand on the ever-shifting dynamics with the executive branch, especially when it comes to executive privilege. What exactly is executive privilege? Well, executive privilege essentially is the right of the President of the United States of America and other high-level officials to withhold information from Congress. Now, this can be beneficial in many ways. Of course, certain national security needs comply with why executive privilege might be exercised. Protecting the privacy of White House deliberations, too, is also of vital importance, especially when it is in the public's best interest to do so. Now, there's no mention of executive privilege in the U.S. Constitution. However, the one way the legislative branch's power over the executive branch is limited is exercised by this notion. This can be incredibly difficult and controversial, as you can see and tell by today's times how powerful the president has become. So by a president claiming executive privilege can get a little bit messy, especially when we're talking about secrecy and parts of our government that we maybe should or should not know. So why exactly do presidents need executive privilege? Well, the basic idea here is this. Any entity like the U.S. government requires a lot of transparency. The American people demand to know what's going on in their government. These are elected officials after all. However, our government can't function if there's no possible way to speak about things in confidentiality. Generally speaking, presidents will invoke executive privilege in matters relating to the following few domains: national security, the military, foreign affairs, and also to protect the names of spies and informants. You see, the president in many ways has to keep this type of information secret safe and only to its trusted advisors if that, especially in times of emergencies and crises. But why has executive privilege become so controversial today? Well, while the courts of our country clearly upheld the idea of executive privilege, scholars today say it's unclear how decision applies beyond a particular case. So this leaves the potential for the idea to be exploited time and time again. What is the limit to its use? Many people wonder and question. How will it be enforced? And are questions that continue to be debated. And hasn't been enough case law to clarify whether congressional investigation can actually override executive privilege from the President of the United States. If you don't believe me that this is controversial, let's take a quick walk through history to see just how executive privilege has been exercised throughout the years. Our current situation today is that a president in many ways are reluctant to exert this type of special power because it often opens up the doors to scrutiny. And also, the courts have tried to avoid this issue directly because I don't think they even have an answer. Let's go back, and I mean way back, to the days of George Washington for us to understand this. Overall, George Washington set the precedent for executive privilege. Keep in mind, our nation was brand new for the time. Now, the story goes like this. After a failed military operation against Native Americans, Congress wanted to know what exactly happened. So Congress sought records and testimony from White House officials under Washington. The president and cabinet agreed that they had the right to refuse these requests in the name of national security interests. They also argued that they had no right to see the Jay Treaty that was signed between the U.S. and Great Britain. However, in the end, he eventually relented in both of these cases and complied with Congress. Now, this may not seem that important to you. However, the stage had been set for executive privilege to be played upon later on. Let's flash forward way in time and talk about the next president who exercised this in a notable fashion. Dwight D. Eisenhower was president of the United States during the 1950s, and overall, he was the first president to actually coin the term itself, executive privilege. Here's the story behind that. So during Senator Joseph McCarthy's crusade against communism, President prevented cabinet members and other advisors from being questioned in the famous McCarthy hearings. In many ways, people project or predict that Eisenhower wanted to protect them. He said, "Any man who testifies won't be working for me that night." Pretty pressing quote. Now, the action here was this. Eisenhower's actions were essentially designed to protect sensitive documents from coming into the public view. And the intent of this was he wanted to continue the tradition of allowing advisors to speak freely without the threat of a subpoena, which is a very serious legal matter. However, in the end, Eisenhower used executive privilege 44 times to protect himself and people around him. McCarthyism swept the country as the Red Scare against communism heated up in America during the Cold War. Executive privilege would really reach a heyday during the Nixon years. Overall, Nixon was the one who really brought it to the forefront of American politics. Here's the story behind that. Nixon attempted to use executive privilege to protect himself and other advisors during the Watergate investigation. As you might recall, Watergate was Nixon's downfall. In the case of U.S. versus Nixon, the Supreme Court unanimously declared that executive privilege was constitutional and sometimes necessary for national security. But it is not all-encompassing, and it does not cover everything. If requested documents and testimonies are a key part of an investigation, they must be brought forward. So, the Watergate tapes were actually turned over to a special prosecutor who would look at them. And then, of course, upon hearing this, shortly after Nixon resigned the office of the presidency, being the only president in the United States to actually do so. Things would also get a little bit murky too in the 90s with President Bill Clinton and some of the scandals that rocked his administration. Let me explain. Overall, the Clinton White House was mired in two major scandals, the Whitewater and Monica Lewinsky case. Whitewater, of course, was a scandal that involved payments that might have gone about to the Clintons and to other entities that weren't so clear-cut and defined. And Monica Lewinsky was essentially a sex scandal that involved the president directly. The story, of course, that deals with executive privilege goes like this. During these investigations, Clinton used the executive privilege 14 times, including, of course, protecting the First Lady, then Hillary Clinton, from testifying under the Whitewater hearings. He also, of course, wanted to protect himself from testifying in both cases, too. Now, the impact of this is that his claims were challenged in the federal court, which is a very high court. However, the courts determined prosecutors' needs outweighed confidentiality of documents and discussions. So the impact here is that the ruling was not appealed to the Supreme Court, which was probably good because Clinton was eventually impeached anyway by the House, although not convicted by the Senate. He was able to actually finish his term. No matter how you look at it, though, by him even claiming executive privilege, many people say today, kind of speaks volumes in and of itself, of the wrongs that he committed, and of course his guilty conscience of it. Executive privilege was even previously invoked during the Obama administration. Let me explain. So overall, President Obama's most famous use of executive privilege was during one of his scandals, the Fast and Furious scandal as it was called. Now the story behind this one is quite interesting. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms ran an operation to sell guns to Mexico in hope that they could track weapons to major drug cartels and bring members to justice. However, the guns were not able to be tracked, and one was eventually used in the killing of a Border Patrol agent. Now, the intent here, Obama and Holder did not know about it until a few weeks prior to the killing and did not authorize this action per se. However, the impact of this was not good. Congress and the Department of Justice had hit a standoff over the sharing of 1,300 documents, many of them, of course, top secret. Now, Obama asserted executive privilege, and he never had to appear in court for this, of course. And Congress voted to cite, however, Eric Holder for contempt of Congress and refusing to comply. Obama's claim of executive privilege was rejected by a federal court, and eventually the documents were turned over. And of course, many people found that this scandal would possibly rock and haunt the Obama years for many years to come. As you can still tell today that we struggle with both immigration and also with safety at the border. But what do you think? In what specific cases today is executive privilege justified? And why do you think the American people just don't like the concept of executive privilege? Answer these two questions and then proceed to the next part of the lesson. Thank you very much for tuning in, and go with completing the rest of the lesson.